As of March 11th, 2024, North Carolinians can place legal sports bets on mobile devices, becoming the 30th state, including Washington, D.C., to launch mobile or online sports gambling.
Though in-person sports betting has been legal on tribal land in North Carolina for 3 years, the launch of mobile sports betting will allow widespread gambling for anyone 21 or older in the state. You'll be able to bet on your phone, from the couch, in your car, at the game, even in the bathroom.
It's a massive expansion of gambling in a state with long-standing objections to wagering of all kinds. A state that took nearly 2 decades to approve the lottery. Sports betting advocates needed less than 6 years from a monumental Supreme Court decision to full legalization. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And how will it change the future of sports in the state? I'm Brian Murphy from WRAL News.
And I'm Tim Donnelly from 99.9 The Fan, and this is a brief history of Triangle Sports on legal sports gambling in North Carolina. Through 4 episodes, we'll explain the history involved, the previous fights that haunted sports betting, the triumphs and failures on both sides of the debate, from a shiny new basketball gym in Raleigh to a conference room in far western North Carolina, from the State House floor to the device that sits less than an arm's length away at all times.
Since 2018, legal betting has become commonplace in the United States, intermixing closer and closer with sports. What was once taboo, spreads, lines, over-unders, prop bets, is now commonplace, fodder for discussion on every sports show. It's about time for some, including ESPN's Mike Greenberg.
I certainly understand people's hesitation when it comes to this, but I have been a proponent of legalized gambling for decades. I've always felt that when something is going on anyway in mass numbers, I believe gambling has been prevalent in the United States, particularly on football and other sporting activities, for decades. I mean, since before my time, and certainly it was when I was in college and other places. I knew where to make bets in college, and I did it all the time. And I think when you take those things out of the darkness and into the light, more good comes of that than bad.
That viewpoint has been winning, along with the promise of more revenue as state after state has adopted mobile sports betting. But many have concerns about this rapid expansion, about what it means for potential addiction issues, for gamblers who can't afford to lose the money they bet, and for sports in general, like former U.S. Olympian and current North Carolina State Representative Marcia Morey.
I love sports for the purity of sports, for the winning and the losing, not for someone else to be benefiting off of, betting on my races. And so just inherently, gambling has a bad taste in my mouth, that we lose the integrity and the beauty of athletic competition when others get involved, not to enjoy the competition, but to put in some financial, money in it. And I think that's a sad state.
No matter what your comfort level is on sports betting, whether you can calculate the odds of a 3-team teaser in your head, or you're not really sure what Panthers -2.5 even means, you've surely noticed its rapid expansion across the U.S. in recent years. A Supreme Court decision in 2018 cleared the way for all states, not just Nevada, to get into sports gambling.
But this is North Carolina, where an anti-gambling law has been on the books since 1764, before the United States even existed. The law said you couldn't win more than 5 shillings a day from a game of chance. There were no single-game parlays in the 1760s, apparently. And over the next 160 years, North Carolina banned public gaming tables and staked card games in public taverns. And though lotteries were used in the 1700s and 1800s to raise money to build roads, churches, government buildings, even Old East on the UNC campus, eventually those too were banned, along with private gaming tables and slot machines. Governor Roy Cooper grew up in Nash County in eastern North Carolina. The 66-year-old has held elected office since 1987. In fact, he's never lost an election.
In North Carolina, there are a lot of people, for faith and other reasons, are morally opposed to gambling and don't believe that there should be any state-sanctioned gambling. Mostly Republicans, but some Democrats fall in that category. Then you have a number of Democrats who believe that gambling is a regressive tax, that it takes advantage of people who are struggling financially.
Cooper is the state's sports fan-in-chief. In the executive mansion, his home, there are signed footballs and soccer balls from North Carolina teams. There's a large framed picture of the 2006 Carolina Hurricanes Stanley Cup winning team with smaller photos of Cooper and family members posing with the cup. But Cooper, like most native Carolinians, was first hooked on college basketball, Atlantic Coast Conference college basketball.
It was college basketball as a kid. It was, the ACC and the ACC tournament, that Friday when there were 8 teams, in my opinion, was the greatest day in sports. And when I was growing up, those games were not on TV and they were on a Friday. So I'll never forget, in school, we could often talk our teachers into having a radio with a piece of aluminum foil on it to make sure we got good reception, to actually listen to those games on that Friday. And usually the only one that was televised was the championship game. And as you know, that was for all the marbles to go to the NCAA. If you did not win the tournament, then you didn't go. And I'll never forget the year that North Carolina State with David Thompson won the national championship. They beat Maryland. Maryland was probably the second best team in the country, but couldn't go to the NCAA tournament because they lost in the championship of the ACC tournament. So it was college basketball for me growing up, and still is in many respects.
That game is still considered the greatest in ACC history. NC State won 103-100 in overtime en route to its first national title.
5, Thompson trying to get away, gets the pass away to Tao, 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, Burleson shot is missed, ball game is over, Wolfpack, national champions, they have done it, the Wolfpack has won the national championship. The final score, NC State 76, Marquette 64.
Basketball in North Carolina was king. Again. The state's love affair with the sport predated even the ACC. It started before Mike Krzyzewski and his 5 national titles at Duke, before Roy Williams and his 3 championships at North Carolina, before Tim Duncan at Wake Forest and Christian Laettner's shot against Kentucky, before Jim Valvano and his cardiac pack in 1983, before Mike Jordan and his jumper delivered a title for Dean Smith in 1982, before David Thompson was a Skywalker, before Frank McGuire's 1957 UNC team took down Wilt Chamberlain for the NCAA title.
Before all of that, before even the ACC, there was Everett Case and the Dixie Classic. We'll be right back. So what exactly was the Dixie Classic? Here's Tim Peeler, longtime writer of ACC basketball history.
Have you ever been to the state fair?
Of course.
Do you know what the excitement on the midway is for 10 straight days over at the fairgrounds? Not just the rides and the food, but just the feel of what it's like to be among people who are excited about something that they've looked forward to all year long. Multiply that by about 10 or 15, and that's what the 4 days of the Dixie Classic was like. Kids waited all year long to see if they were lucky enough to get tickets in their stockings at Christmas to be able to go to the tournament. The tournament was an unusual format. It was the week between Christmas and New Year's, all played at NC State's Reynolds Coliseum right after it opened. And it was 4 teams from out of state playing against the 4 schools from in-state. At that time, they were generally known as the Big Four: NC State, North Carolina, Duke, and Wake Forest. And it was the out-of-state schools would play the in-state schools, the winners would meet, the losers would meet, and they would all play 4 games during that time. And they ended up the event ranked 1 through 8. They played consolation games. So they ranked everybody 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No team from out of state ever won the Dixie Classic. NC State won most of them. North Carolina won a couple. Wake Forest won 1. But it was just the fact that it was a full-time celebration of basketball.
Tim Peeler now works as a writer at NC State, his alma mater. From Western North Carolina, he arrived on State's campus in the fall of 1983, just months after Valvano and the Wolfpack claimed the school's last national title. Everett Case came to NC State a few decades earlier in 1946, after leaving the Navy, and the former longtime Indiana high school coach, changed basketball. Here's Tim Peeler again.
He introduced a little thing that they used to do back in Indiana after winning that conference championship, and he told all of his players to go under one of the baskets and start cutting down the nets with a pair of trainer scissors that he gave them. It's the first time in college basketball that was done. The next 2 years, NC State won the Southern Conference tournament again. Everett opened his palatial new arena on NC State's campus. It was called Reynolds Coliseum. It seated 12,400 people. And over the next 50 years, it was the center of the universe for college basketball, not just here in North Carolina, not just in the South, but in the country. No other arena hosted more college basketball games, no on campus anyway, arena hosted more college games than Reynolds Coliseum. It was his show place, and it was the place that he wanted to have a holiday tournament.
Reynolds Coliseum hosted the Dixie Classic from 1949 to 1960. At its height, more than 70,000 fans attended the tournament annually. But fans were not the only ones interested in college basketball. The sport had grabbed the attention of gamblers in New York, and soon the scandals that had impacted the sport reached North Carolina. Tim Peeler remembers how it all fell apart.
Too much attention was being paid to the players by the gamblers, and they brought them here. And make no mistake, those were rough times. If one of the players at NC State who was accused of shaving points one year against Duke, he accepted $1,000 to make sure NC State won by more than 12, and NC State only won by 10. He scored 10 points in the game. The gambler showed up at his apartment over in Cameron Village. He was married. He had a family. They showed up at the door with a gun in their waistbands and took him out for a walk and said, "This can never happen again." He could see the gun in the waistband. He gave the money back. $1,000 to him in 1960 was a fortune none of us could imagine today. And he was frightened. And there were 3 other players on NC State's team at that time who were also involved. There were half dozen players from South Carolina who were involved. There were players from North Carolina involved. So it was not centered to one team. It was becoming a huge scandal across the country.
The point shaving scandal impacted more than 24 schools across the country. 4 players from NC State and 1 from North Carolina were charged with bribery in local courts. 8 people who paid the players either pleaded guilty or were convicted in North Carolina.
Dr. William Friday, who was the head of the Consolidated University System, thought that basketball was overwhelming the educational missions of the schools, and the fact that the violence of gambling that could have been introduced at the time was taken away from it. So he wanted to see both NC State and North Carolina, both of whom were part of the gambling point shaving scandals of 1960, 1961. He wanted to see them de-emphasize basketball because too much attention was being paid to it.
Among Friday's punishments was reducing the number of games that UNC and NC State could play. One major casualty, the Dixie Classic.
The biggest punishment that they could suffer was no participation and the elimination of the Dixie Classic. Both teams cut down to only about 12 to 14 games for 4 or 5 years during the early 1960s. It was a big deal. That's what got Frank McGuire to leave. He didn't want to put up with all the different things that happened during that time. That's why Dean Smith was hired at North Carolina. Everett Case remained as head coach at NC State through the 60s, but you could see the impact that the gambling scandal had on him because he preached against it. He preached about it. He said, don't do it. He had SBI officers coming in to talk to his players. He had his scrapbook of all the bad things that could happen to you from the 1950s. All of his players knew about it, and 4 of them did it anyway.
The Classic would end, but the state's love affair with college basketball would continue. More than 60 years later, opponents of sports gambling legislation would invoke the Dixie Classic and its associated scandal in their arguments to block the bill.
Legalization would face more than the ghosts of a gambling scandal and the demise of the beloved holiday tournament. It would have to contend with lingering hard feelings about another fight over gambling expansion, the lottery. Like sports betting, votes for and against the lottery did not break down along partisan lines. And while the legislating process for sports betting involved some chaotic moments, it had nothing on the drama involved in trying to get the lottery passed in North Carolina. WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie has covered the state legislature for 2 decades. The politics of the state have changed dramatically in those 20 years. Republicans have controlled the state legislature for more than a decade now, but at the time of the lottery fights, it was Democrats who controlled state government.
The first bill was filed in 1983, if I remember correctly, but it just kind of bounced around for 20 years or so, really. People kind of had talked about it, and as more states around North Carolina started getting lotteries, of course, it sort of increased the pressure on North Carolina to have their own. People were crossing the borders to buy tickets, just like they crossed the borders to do other things these days, right? So, it was 2005 when there finally sort of became enough political will to make it actually happen. And that was a kind of okay, well, let me just back it up for a second. In 2005, it was strange bedfellows because you had a handful of Republicans that were willing to go along with it and just enough Democrats. And at the time, the Democrats were by far in the majority. But a lot of Democrats were not interested in having this lottery, especially the ones who are further to the left, because they said it was going to prey on the poor, the people who were less educated, minority groups, so they fought it for a long time.
Like sports betting nearly 2 decades later, the votes were close, the pressure intense.
So in the House, it went through the House first. I think it was like April or May. The vote was, I think, really close. It was like 2 apart, like 61-59 or something. And there was tremendous pressure put on people that were in both caucuses, especially the Democrats, people who didn't really want to vote for this to just go ahead and hold their nose and do this because they said, it's all money for education. We're not going to supplant any money that we're already spending on education. We promise this will be extra. Yeah. So anyway, Pricey Harrison, I think, was the one that sort of most famously agonized over this. And she hit the green button. And then you could see her with her head in her hands. There's a picture out there of this. And immediately after the vote, she went up to, at the time, Speaker Jim Black was presiding, Democrat, and asked him if he would allow her to change her vote because she saw that there was enough of a margin. So, what that tells you is that she voted to help him out, not because she wanted to be on the record as supporting the lottery, right? Okay, so it gets through the House, but then it gets to the Senate, and it runs into a buzzsaw. So in the Senate, they simply did not have the numbers. So they adjourned for the summer.
Pricey Harrison remains in the House. She was a sharp and vocal critic of mobile sports betting.
And look, this happens. Brian, I think we all know, especially today, politicians aren't always going to agree.
Yeah, the House and the Senate don't always agree. The chambers didn't during the sports betting process either. Even if they're controlled by the same political party, there are differences. And so it's not surprising that on a highly contentious issue like the lottery, they couldn't find consensus in the summer of 2005.
But what happened next? Well, that's something that doesn't happen often, and something that folks around state politics still discuss. Here's how WRAL covered the Senate vote on the day that it happened.
North Carolina is a pin stroke away from a state lottery.
It took patience and political wrangling to pass the controversial bill. The vote was a tie. 24 for, 24 against. Lieutenant Governor Bev Perdue stepped in to cast the deciding vote for the lottery. Lori Clowers has been at the legislature all day and joins us live now with a look at how all of this came to pass. Lori?
Well, David, the result was made possible here by the absence of 2 senators. Senator Garwood of Wilkes County became ill, you may remember, here at the legislature last week. He was taken to the hospital. He is home recuperating, but definitely could not be here today. Senator Brown of Onslow County was on his honeymoon. He got married earlier this year and expected the session to be over by now. Apparently, he was wrong. It's interesting that both of these Republicans were targeted by radio ads just recently. They were seen as the only Republican opponents who might be wavering on this issue. Senate leaders, with their absence, seized the moment.
Favorable on House Bill 1023, North Carolina State Lottery Act.
It was brought up for a vote only after supporters knew it would pass, with 2 senators absent and Lieutenant Governor Bev Perdue suspending the rules that require votes on 2 separate days. The bill's main sponsor made his pitch.
But I think it's time for North Carolina to join the other states. All the southeastern states around us have the lottery. We are supporting schools in other states that are badly needed here.
After hearing debate from several opponents,
and a lottery is nothing but a fleecing of your own people.
The result was as expected, a tie vote with Purdue breaking it.
The president of the Senate votes aye.
Supporters say the bill could mean $400 million a year for education. 50% would go to class size reduction and other education initiatives. 40% would go to the construction of new schools. 10% would go to scholarships. Lottery opponents are not convinced.
Well, it's a sad day that after 23 years of trying, when the gambling industry has finally prevailed in North Carolina and convinced the state to go into the gambling business with them.
Lori, within minutes of that passage today, some people were already referring to this as the Senate shenanigans. Tell me about the atmosphere in the chamber.
Oh, David, it was definitely suspenseful in one word. We didn't know it was going to happen until it did. There were procedural moves and objections all along, and it wasn't until the final vote that we knew.
So, a few key points here. The Senate has 50 members, but 2 opponents were absent, resulting in a tie vote. And it was the lieutenant governor who cast the tie-breaking vote.
Right, and there were ways for the 2 absent members, one sick and one on his honeymoon, to still have their votes counted.
Much like the lottery, politics can be a game, and Senate Democrats won that game by hitting the numbers when 2 Republicans were absent.
It looks like the mafia is driving the train. Is there no honor amongst us?
Does the process at all feel dirty to you?
It's a tough process.
Senator Janet Cowell was one of only 5 Democrats to vote against the lottery. Still, she concedes senators should not be surprised. They had 4 days' notice to show up.
Was this an ethical process in your mind? Was this fair play?
Yes, absolutely. Anybody can come or leave as they please. We never tell any member to come or not come.
On that point, not the lottery, Republican leader Phil Berger agreed.
The fact that we had a vote today, all of those are things that if people are paying attention and understand what's going on, those things can happen.
You get the votes however you can get the votes.
News and Observer political columnist Rob Christensen says all's fair in love, war, and legislative politics. Because polls show most voters favor a lottery, he believes they'll overlook the political tactics as long as they can play.
I don't think there's any really strong political fallout as a result of the way it was done.
Governor Mike Easley signed the North Carolina State Lottery Act into law the next day, August 31st, 2005. 7 months later, the first scratch-off tickets went on sale. In May, the Powerball came to the state. In October, the lottery added daily evening drawings. In the first 13 months, total sales for the lottery hit $1 billion.
Good evening, I'm Tina Selden Cash with tonight's lottery drawings for Tuesday, February 20th, 2024. Our first winning Carolina Pick 3 number tonight is 1. Second Pick 3 is 9.
Now, 17 years later, in the 2023 fiscal year, the lottery had $4.3 billion in sales and more than $1 billion in funding for education programs. The lottery has given more than $10 billion to the state since it started in 2006, much of it for education and public schools.
I spoke with WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie on where the lottery stands today and where the money goes. Most supporters would say, hey, look, the sun still rises in the east and sets in the west, and the state's made an awful lot of money off the lottery, and everybody seems to be doing just fine. The opponents will say it's done exactly what we argued it would do. It's preying on the poor, on minority groups, on those who can least afford it, and the money for schools, while great, has not really been a supplemental. It's sort of been put in place of money that the legislature would have given.
It absolutely has, and I think that's something that we'll have to keep an eye on as we watch sports gambling too, is the way that the money, just because a legislature today decides to do particular things with money doesn't mean that the next legislature has to do the same things. And so they came into the lottery with a promise that this was all going to education, and year by year, little by little, that kind of got whittled away. The supplant language kind of went away so they could use it, especially when we hit the recession in 2008, 2009. They were in a hole, and so they basically were just shoveling lottery money into the budget to try to staunch the flow of red ink. And so yeah, that kind of all went out the window.
Representative Jason Sain is a budget chairman in the state house. He was a main sponsor of sports gambling legislation. While some might have hard feelings about the lottery, there's no willingness to act.
Yes, there were people that were opposed to it. I can't get anyone to produce a bill, even a draft bill, eliminating the state lottery because they don't know how to make up the hole to fund school construction, which was one of the things in our caucus. Folks who have been opposed to the lottery, and I was actually opposed to the lottery when it came. I was working for an organization called Citizens for a Sound Economy. Dan Gerlach was the budget director at that time for Governor Mike Easley. Very involved in that, very opposed to it. After it passed, you know what? It didn't really ruin society. Nothing crashed because of it. Schools did get more funding for construction.
North Carolina was one of the last states to legalize the lottery. 4 states came later than North Carolina, and 5 states, Alabama, Alaska, Hawaii, Nevada, and Utah, don't have the lottery to this day. In 2005, when North Carolina approved the lottery, sports betting wasn't even an option for the state. A 1992 federal law, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, limited sports betting to states where it already existed. That meant Nevada, the home of sports betting, and a few other states where people could bet on multiple games as part of a lottery. Nevada was the only state in which you could legally wager on a single game.
But eventually, New Jersey challenged that federal law, and the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court in December of 2017. The case and their decision would change legal sports gambling nationwide. We'll be right back.
We'll hear argument first this morning in Case 16-476, Christie versus NCAA, and the consolidated Case 16-477, the New Jersey Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association versus NCAA. Mr. Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court.
This is audio from the argument before the U.S. Supreme Court.
What Congress can do is enact a statute that places restrictions on sports betting and have a finely reticulated statute. It can adopt the provision that it permitted Nevada to have, which is careful regulation of something that's taking place. What we have now is activity that is billions of dollars that is taking place throughout the United States. It is all unlawful. What New Jersey decided to do
That's
is
your selective prosecution theory, that they're permitting fantasy teams?
No. I'm not talking about fantasy at all. I'm talking about betting on sports games.
There are 4 states that are permitted to continue.
Nevada has sports betting, and it has it regulated. It prohibits criminals from going into the business. It has open books and so forth. Those other 3 states were small slivers of lotteries. What I'm saying is, and all of the evidence supports this, that betting on sports is taking place all over the United States. 5% of it is legal in Nevada. The rest of it is illegal.
Thank you, counsel. The case is submitted.
In the next episode of A Brief History of Triangle Sports, the Supreme Court makes its decision, and it wouldn't take long for some in North Carolina to try to get into the game, from a secret, private gathering of supporters through a spectator-free pandemic and to the verge of sports gambling's passage in the state. That's all in Episode 2. A Brief History of Triangle Sports is a production of Capital Broadcasting Company. Brian Murphy's extensive reporting is the basis of this season, along with reporting from other journalists at WRAL News and coverage from 99.9 The Fan. Graham Hill is our studio producer. Each episode is mixed by Doug Miller. Anita Normanley is our executive producer. Thanks for listening.